Why is everybody unhappy with the official Jeffrey Epstein narrative?
Epstein.
Why are there more theories about who controlled him, who he worked for, what his plans were, more than any other figure in modern history? Epstein is the enigma that keeps fueling more conspiracy theories, such as the growing Mossad Epstein theory. And even if you already believe in this theory, or don't particularly care about this theory, I still think you should see what I've uncovered in this video, because it shows how disgustingly corrupt the US political and justice system is, and how much external influence there is. Back to Epstein, a New York almost billionaire. His rise from a humble maths teacher to being worth over $600 million, a private island, a fleet of aircraft, and one of Manhattan's largest private residences in just a few years definitely raises some eyebrows. He built social ties with billionaires, presidents, and billionaire presidents, such as Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, another New York billionaire. Even famous and influential people like Bill Gates, Prince Andrew, Elon Musk, Noam Chomsky, Michael Jackson, Kevin Spacey, the Koch brothers, Andrew Cuomo, RFK Jr., and so many more. Billionaires, princes, presidents, scientists, CEOs, and C-suite execs, governors, this man knew them all. If you were in any way part of the elite, you knew this guy and were likely close to him. His connections pushed him into the spotlight when in 2019 he supposedly committed suicide in a jail cell in New York, which fueled so many conspiracy theories. The official narrative is that he was arrested in 2005 and 2019 for procuring minors for prostitution and sex trafficking respectively. His first arrest resulted in a conviction with just a 13-month jail sentence and house arrest. I'll come back to this later because it reveals a lot. His latter arrest led to his death in the jail cell, officially ruled a suicide, both when it happened in 2019 as well as in the memo between the DOJ and the FBI in 2025. However, absolutely no one believes the fact that he killed himself. In fact, I can almost guarantee you don't believe that either. Only 15 to 20% of US adults actually believe the official narrative. Interestingly enough, this is bridging a gap between both the liberals and conservatives, as both are extremely unhappy with how it's being handled. The DOJ's walkback triggered an immediate and furious political backlash, most strongly from within President Trump's own base.
And I think the real answer is Jeffrey Epstein was working on behalf of intel services, probably not American. And we have every right to ask, on whose behalf was he working? How does a guy go from being a math teacher at the Dalton School in the late 70s with no college degree to having multiple airplanes, a private island, and the largest residential house in Manhattan? Where did all the money come from? And no one has ever gotten to the bottom of that because no one has ever tried. And moreover, it's extremely obvious to anyone who watches that this guy had direct connections to a foreign government. Now, no one's allowed to say that that foreign government is Israel because we have been somehow cowed into thinking that that's naughty. There is nothing wrong with saying that. There is nothing hateful about saying that. There's nothing anti-Semitic about saying, there's nothing even anti-Israel about saying that. I've spent my entire life pretty much in Washington, where I knew and loved a number of people, including one very close person who worked at CIA. That has never prohibited me from saying, I think the CIA has done some horrible things, murdered a bunch of people, participated in the murder of a sitting US president. It's got a whole trail of crimes. That doesn't make me a disloyal American. It doesn't make me anti-American in any sense. I was born here. My family's been here for hundreds of years. I love this country. That's why I live here. So criticizing the behavior of a government agency does not make you a hater. It makes you a free person. You have had all this contact with the foreign government. Were you working on behalf of Mossad? Were you running a blackmail operation on behalf of a foreign government? By the way, every single person in Washington, D.C. thinks that. I've never met anyone who doesn't think that. I don't know any of them that hate Israel, but no one feels they can say that. Why?
MAGA fault line seems to be widening from a fracture into a Grand Canyon-sized chasm after President Trump called the very MAGA supporters who reelected him stupid and foolish for refusing his demand to back off the Epstein files.
We're getting flooded with thousands, hundreds of thousands of comments that are very unhappy about this. President Trump was elected primarily to go after the deep state. We want to go after the deep state.
It seems like you think your base is stupid. That's how I feel. I feel like Trump thinks his base is stupid.
Bringing this into the public arena was President Trump. That's a matter of historic record.
Millions of Americans are not satisfied with what we've been told. And we shouldn't be, because it's been contradictory and insulting to our intelligence every step of the way.
Trump should not be insulting and attacking the people who voted him in and supported him simply because they want answers on this notorious case of a high-profile individual.
Why did they say there was thousands of hours of tapes of people doing horrible shit. Why did they say that?
I can't reconcile this Donald Trump with the Trump that we're seeing right now, the Trump that is gaslighting the public right now, the Trump that I voted for across multiple elections. The Epstein scandal is definitely terminal cancer to Trump's MAGA movement.
Where did that whole case go? Where did all the files go? They just went nowhere? No one even believes that.
This stinks. This just reeks.
Something is horribly wrong here.
Pam Bondi needs to be fired.
How many of you are satisfied? You can clap. Satisfied with the results of the Epstein investigation? Clap. How many of you are not satisfied with the results of the investigation?
As we've seen, the MAGA wing especially feels betrayed, as they thought Trump was going to drain the swamp. I guess they didn't know how close Trump was to Epstein and everything he said about him. Unsurprisingly, those on the left weren't happy either.
And I think that there's a sense of like a clear story of a group of elite people that are getting away with the worst crimes that could have ever been done, and that there's a cover-up. And if Trump's participating in that cover-up, it's bad for his brand. That's my contention.
Yeah, I think that's and if it gets bad enough, then he has to blame somebody. And that's really where this could have value. It's not I don't think it's going to scare any voters away from Trump. But I do think that it could create pressure on him enough where he would be worried about that, where he has to throw somebody under the bus, which could be really inconvenient.
For that reason, so many conspiracy theories have begun circling the internet, including the claim that Jeffrey Epstein is an Israeli spy, namely from Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency akin to the Israeli CIA.
I want you to understand something. My assessment is Jeffrey Epstein absolutely belongs to intelligence, okay? Whether it's just the FBI or Mossad, I think it's a bit of both. Jeffrey Epstein belonged to numerous intelligence communities, and as a part of his operations, he was like a fixer, an in-between, a guy who connected a lot of rich and powerful people, and simultaneously was a serial blackmail operation, right? Blackmailing a lot of the super wealthy, regardless of their ideological background. It's not like a liberal versus Republican conservative type situation. It's more so elites that run the world type situation.
This theory suggests Epstein used his network to gather compromising information, also known as compromat, on global elites, namely American politicians, potentially allowing Mossad to exert control over US and global policy. It is what is known as a honeypot operation, which uses a bait to lure the target to gain compromising information on them. It is commonly used in both espionage as well as recently in cybersecurity, with former Assistant FBI Director William C. Sullivan saying the use of sex is a common practice among intelligence services all over the world. This is a tough, dirty business. We have used that technique against the Soviets, they have used it against us. This all shows that it is not an unusual idea to claim that one intelligence agency has implanted a spy to gather intel to blackmail other governments, even with allied or powerful governments like the United States. If anything, those attributes can mean a higher likelihood for being a target of espionage. In fact, it is not a secret that Israel and Mossad runs many operations to gather intel from American institutions. One source says that illicitly obtained intelligence was flying so voluminously from Lakam, which was a defunct Israeli intelligence agency focused on scientific and technical intel, into Israeli intelligence that it gathered its own special code name, which was not supposed to be discussed with the Americans. After Jonathan Pollard, who was a US Navy employee in Washington DC, was arrested for selling secrets to Israel, the Israeli leadership denied all knowledge. The top leadership, of course, knew what was going on. One former Israeli intelligence official recalled that Peres and Rabin, both very sophisticated in the handling of intelligence, and who were both also prime ministers of Israel, meaning they were at some point heads of Mossad, were quick to ask, as the official put, "Where are we getting this stuff?" They were told, the Israeli added, that Israeli intelligence has a penetration into the US intelligence community. Both men let it go. No one said, "Stop it here and now." Ironically enough, to show just how great of an ally Israel was, it also passed intel it gathered on America to its arch rival, the Soviet Union. In another shocking twist, a CIA report in 1979 found that Israel tried to penetrate the US Consulate General in Jerusalem via blackmailing one of the employees, getting an Israeli girl to get into a relationship with an employee and gathering intel that way. They tried to bribe US Marines for intel, and Israel planted hidden mics in the American ambassador's office in Tel Aviv and even in the residences of the military, all to gather intel against the United States. A report went about which showed how American intelligence knew that Country A, identified by intelligence sources as Israel, conducts the most aggressive espionage operation against the United States of any US ally. Classified military information and sensitive military technologies are high priority targets for the intelligence agencies of this country. Another memo in 1995 talked about how Israel aggressively collects US military and industrial technology, and how they sold American tech it stole via Intel to China.
When I worked for the Department of Defense, we were doing a stand down, like a big training thing in an auditorium on what to look for regarding insider threats, right? So this is like DOD employees who might possibly be looking to spy or pull classified information out for nefarious purposes or something. And they're going through, as part of the training, all of these actual cases that happened over the years. And out of the 9 or 10 that they showed us, there's 1 or 2 where the guy just had a gambling addiction and he needed money and he just didn't care and he was going to do it. But literally, like the other 8 or 9, 90% of all the ones they showed us were Chinese guys, Chinese Americans spying for China, Russian Americans spying for Russia, Jewish Americans spying for Israel. And all of them, pretty much, this was just a pattern and nobody was talking about it. The trainers weren't talking about it. They were just pretending like it didn't exist. And so leave it to me. I raised my hand at the end when they took questions. And I brought that fact up. I was like, what are we supposed to exactly do with that information? And to the guy's credit, he was honest. He didn't try to blow smoke up me or anything. He just said, you're not to look at that at all. Like, that's not something we consider.
According to CIA counterterrorism specialist Philip Giraldi, the Jewish state regularly tops the list for ostensibly friendly countries that aggressively conduct espionage against the US. Giraldi claimed Mossad would have exploited Epstein's contacts. Those blackmailed would undoubtedly in most cases cooperate with the foreign government involved to avoid a major scandal. Fallen into the hands of the American justice system in Florida, he could have provided information far more explosive than whatever was happening at Bear Stearns, as well as him saying that he has little doubt that Epstein was running an intelligence operation. There is no other viable explanation for his filming of prominent politicians and celebrities having sex with young girls.
Who did you not at all trust, even though you had to work with them?
The Israelis.
You didn't trust them?
Not as far as I could throw them. We don't allow the Israelis into CIA headquarters because they would always come with gifts, and the gifts had always listening devices packed inside them. And somebody brings you a gift, you x-ray it. It's the normal process. And we're like, you guys can't keep coming back here every single time trying to bug our conference rooms. So no more. So,
and was it easy to x-ray and see that they had bugs in them?
Yeah.
What percentage of the time did gifts have bugs in them?
100%.
Be quiet.
No, seriously.
Are you kidding me?
Absolutely not. I wish I was.
100% of the time they brought gifts that had bugs in them.
Yeah. And we're like, okay, no more. You can't come on campus anymore.
Were you guys joking?
Come on, you guys. No, they were serious. They were hoping one would slip through. So we had a safe house in Virginia, and we would meet with them there. So I'm one of like 8 analysts at the time. And because I was the junior most analyst, I went last. So, the political analyst, the econ analyst, the oil analyst, the military analyst, they all take their turns. And it comes to me. And because I was overt at the time, I used my true name. So I said, my name is John Kiriakou, and I'm going to brief you today on Saddam Hussein's state of mind. And the Mossad guy, his glasses were like this. And he says, spell your name? So I spell it. And then in front of all my colleagues, he says to me, you are Jewish? And I said, I am not recruitable. I am not recruitable. Don't even think about it. I was so furious that he was ready to cold pitch me right there in front of all my colleagues. Like, let's have lunch afterwards. Like, get out of here.
There are so many more examples I can show, but to save on time, we can very easily see Israel's history of espionage against the United States, even selling that stolen intel to China and the Soviets. So the question now becomes, how does Epstein fit into the Epstein-Mossad theory? Well, if we take a chronological look at his life, we don't have to take long to discover the links. Epstein was good at maths and physics, but ended up dropping out of college to become a high school maths teacher, a job he only held for 2 years due to poor performance. Despite his poor performance, he was given a job by then CEO of Bear Stearns, Alan Greenberg, one of the biggest investment banks in the world. Bear in mind that this guy never even completed a college degree, yet he became a partner at Bear Stearns in just 4 years. Already quite suspicious. He then left and founded several shady consulting groups, of which there isn't much publicly known about, except of one main client he got. Our first link, a man called Leslie Wexner. Wexner was the founder of L Brands, which owned companies like Victoria's Secret, Pink, Bath & Body Works, and had holdings in Abercrombie & Fitch. This man was rich, as in $16 billion rich. Wexner's reliance on Epstein was extraordinary, and here's the really strange part. Despite only knowing him for a few years, Wexner gave Epstein sweeping powers of attorney over his personal trusts and foundations, which meant that Epstein now had complete control of all of Wexner's wealth, enterprise, and therefore connections. He acquired Wexner's New York mansion, several other luxury properties, and a private plane. Wexner later accused Epstein of misappropriating vast sums of money after Epstein got arrested, but curiously never chose to press charges, which shows that he likely said that just to save face, because he knew that those charges had no grounds, and they were likely both in on it together. So this mega billionaire came in and gave this random banker who was just a maths teacher like 5 years ago access to all of his money, influence, and network. How does this relate to Israel? Well, here's the link. Wexner co-founded the group called the Study Group in 1991 with Charles Bronfman. It later got renamed to the Mega Group. This informal organization of wealthy and influential Jewish businessmen focused on pro-Israel advocacy and philanthropy, meeting twice a year for philanthropy and Judaism seminars to 50 members, including Steven Spielberg.
Or they were working together in some other way. So Wexner's another one of these interesting cats, right? Like where his mentor was a real estate guy mainly, but he did a lot of things named Max Fisher. And I think he was originally from Indiana, Max Fisher, but lived in Ohio, I believe. But anyway, either way, he was Wexner's mentor for a while. Not his mentor like when he was just getting started. Wexner's already rich by this point. It's not about that. Fisher's his big main thing was philanthropic contributions in management for Jewish and Zionist and State of Israel related causes, right? And so when you look at like what the Wexner Foundation did, for example, they would give a little bit of money to Ohio State University here and there, and like a few other things locally there in Columbus and around the state of Ohio. But the vast majority of it went to Zionist organizations, Jewish organizations, things like that. Which fine. Fisher's the guy that sort of did what Yitzhak Shamir did with Robert Maxwell, but for Les Wexner. You go to him and you say, you've got an obligation here to the Jewish state. You're a Jewish billionaire. You're a big important person in the most powerful country in the world. Like, you have an obligation to your people. And again, it's a powerful call. And so it really came to, in a lot of ways, define Wexner's life after that. So in the 1990s, Wexner and Edgar Bronfman, who I mentioned earlier, one of the heirs to the Seagram's liquor fortune, who was one of Jeffrey Epstein's clients when he was working at Bear Stearns, those two guys founded a group called the Study Group, but it's more commonly known as the Mega Group. That came out in the papers a little bit in the late 1990s. Not a lot was written about it. It was a group of, at first, about 20, but then later it expanded Jewish billionaires in the United States and Canada who would meet at least twice a year to get together and just coordinate how they were distributing their philanthropic money, what their focuses were for that year, just making sure they were all acting in concert to help serve the interests of Israel in their respective countries. And they would finance scholars and other professionals to write up papers and studies and analyses for the Israeli government, for Israeli intelligence, for example, and they were very plugged into that, and very, very, very connected to the Israeli government and specifically Israeli intelligence through the work that they would do for the Israelis, and again, just one more sort of connection there to the intelligence world among people who were very, very, very close to Jeffrey Epstein.
As a pro-Israel lobby, it employed Republican political consultant Frank Luntz in 2003 to mobilize support for Israel, serving as a vehicle for Israeli influence operations in the US. One of the main areas of activity was Partnership for Excellence in Jewish Education, as well as Birthright Israel, which is a program aimed at sending young Jews to Israel for the summer to try and convince them to like Israel, move to Israel, and often fall in love with an Israeli. Former NSA counterintelligence expert John Schindler said that we know that Mega was viewed by Israeli intelligence officials as a vehicle for espionage and influence operations in the US. Jeffrey Epstein was reportedly a key beneficiary of the structure. He is said to have used the group to build up his network of high-ranking contacts in business, media, and politics. This positions the Mega Group not as a club Epstein happened to join, but as a strategic asset provided to him by his patron and the group's co-founder, Leslie Wexner. NSA counter-spy Schindler said that Epstein appears to have been part of this shadowy Israeli influence operation known as Mega. The group provided the perfect environment for an access agent to operate, bringing together the wealthy and powerful in a non-threatening setting ideal for talent spotting, networking, and influence in a far more subtle way than official diplomatic channels. As American journalist Glenn Greenwald said, a key source of Epstein's vast wealth, though mysterious, was from Les Wexner, whose primary life cause is Israel. His influence extends deep into the Israeli state itself. The Wexner Foundation runs prestigious fellowship programs that train senior Israeli civil servants, public officials, and military officers, often through studies at Harvard University. The alumni of these programs form a powerful and elite network within the Israeli establishment, including top figures, such as former IDF Chief of Staff Aviv Kohavi. This creates a direct channel of influence and a deep institutional bond between the Wexner network and the Israeli state apparatus. The very power of this foundation has made it a subject of political controversy within Israel. In 2023, the extremely far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir ordered the Israel police to sever ties with the foundation, accusing it of involvement with obvious left-wing political movements. However, even Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he considers Wexner a good Jewish philanthropist who loves Israel and has no ulterior motives. In other words, Israel can trust Wexner as he just wants to build up their power and influence. It wasn't just that Wexner was a massive Israeli and Mossad link, having Israel as his main purpose. It wasn't just that Wexner was the key financial backer or professional connector for Epstein, which allowed him to build all the initial contacts and foundation for the abuse he had. It's also that Wexner supposedly knew exactly what Epstein was doing with his trafficking.
But it doesn't explain motive. It doesn't explain why Wexner would give him all of this at the very young age with no relevant experience as a tax advisor, as an investor. It's just like,
I mean, think about this, Tucker. There was a point in the 1980s when it might have been the early 90s actually. Wexner again owned Victoria's Secret. For a guy like Jeffrey Epstein, that's kind of a gold mine you're sitting on, right? Because he would go out and he would pose as a talent scout. He would tell people that he was that, and he would present credentials that made it plausible. And he would get girls who wanted to be models, who wanted to be in Victoria's Secret, to pose for him, and then he would sexually assault them at times. And so word got around that he was doing this, and two of the top executives at Victoria's Secret together, guys who had worked there for years, knew Wexner well. They went to him together and presented the evidence and told him that this is what this guy's doing, and they never heard anything more about it. Nothing happened. And so you ask, like, you got this young, I guess, run-of-the-mill money manager dude who at Wexner at this point is only known for a few years. It's not like they have a decades-long relationship or anything. And two of your top executives come and say he's using your name basically to sexually assault women who want to work for our company. And it gets blown off. And you say, who could get away with something like that? You know, and the answer is the kind of guy that Wexner would give full power of attorney over his estate to, I suppose, you know?
This all leads to the very high possibility that Wexner was actually in on the scheme, that he had knowledge of the plan and vision, and he dedicated his financial position, his network, and his business all to support Epstein in his mission to implant Israeli influence in American elites. Here's what we know. 1. Epstein hadn't had much experience in the real world, dropping out of college, teaching math at high school, and then somehow landed a job at Bear Stearns despite his poor performance, where he became a partner in just a few years. 2. Leslie Wexner, a very wealthy billionaire whose primary life cause is Israel, gives Epstein sweeping powers of attorney after just knowing him for a few years, meaning he now has control over everything he owns. 3. The Wexner Foundation, which Epstein now controls, funds Israeli civil servants, Mossad and military officers and public officials with scholarships at prestigious universities like Harvard, making them part of an Israeli alumni network. The Wexner Foundation also donated a great majority of its funding to Zionist organizations. 4. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu considers Wexner to be a good Jewish philanthropist who loves Israel and has no ulterior motive. 5. Wexner knew of Epstein's sexual harassment claims, which he did using his own brand names, Victoria's Secret. 6. The Mega Group, which Epstein was a part of, was called a shadowy Israeli influence operation by NSA officials and would fund papers, analyses, and studies for Israel and Israeli intelligence. 7. Even when Epstein gets arrested, Wexner never presses charges, likely knowing that he'd be done in with Epstein as well, even if seen as just a co-conspirator for Israel. Okay, so we have a well-connected multi-billionaire whose main life purpose is supporting Israel, helping Epstein out in order to pursue their plot. Is that all? Not even close. The next link is a man called Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoff, a Yiddish-speaking Orthodox Jewish Czechoslovakian who later changed his name to Ian Robert Maxwell. He escaped Nazi occupation and fought for the British in World War II, eventually gaining both British and Israeli citizenship. Maxwell was a well-known man in the intelligence circles, working not just for the British MI6 and Soviet KGB, but also for the Israeli Mossad, with suspicions of him being a double or even a triple agent. After the war, he worked for the Allied-controlled Commission in Berlin's press section, a position that gave him his first taste of the interplay between media, power, and information control. He built a global media empire that included the Mirror Group of newspapers and Macmillan Publishers. He was also a Labour MP and moved in the highest circles of global power. Maxwell's service and impact for Israel cannot be understated. He was the one responsible for securing weapons for the Israeli army during their ceasefire in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War from Soviet Union via his home country of Czechoslovakia. He used his own links to supply the weapons, including smuggling aircraft parts that were vital for achieving air supremacy. Without those weapons, Israel would have very likely lost the war and would probably not exist today. Investigative journalists Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon in Robert Maxwell, Israel's super spy, say that he was a dedicated asset for Israel, using British, American, and Israeli intelligence sources to arrive to this conclusion.
But that's two sources that say that. So that's what Yitzhak Shamir was up to. And he goes to Robert Maxwell and he talks to him about his obligations as a Jewish billionaire and a important guy with intelligence community connections in foreign countries, the obligations that he has to the Jewish state of Israel. And, that can be that can be very, very compelling especially to people who are kind of mercenary types like Maxwell and kind of always have been from a very young age, feeling like they're living in a foreign country because they are. And then, you start to get this appeal of like obligation to something really meaningful.
For starters, Maxwell was a key member in distributing the Prosecutor's Management Information System, aka PROMIS software. It was his connections as well as his media empire that gave cover to the distribution of the software. Mossad allegedly modified the software with a secret trapdoor, creating an electronic Trojan horse that allowed them to spy on the very intelligent agencies and government bodies that purchased it. Maxwell was allegedly the frontman for these sales. He enabled the alleged mass spying on governments and financial institutions worldwide, including in sensitive US nuclear labs like Sandia National Laboratories and Los Alamos National Laboratory. This mirrors exactly how Epstein ran his blackmail operation: gain access to sensitive information and compromise via hidden technological tools, such as a software backdoor or hidden cameras and mics. Gather intel, and then use it for blackmail. They used a legitimate business enterprise as a front for massive intelligence gathering, blackmail, and espionage. Perhaps most famously, former Mossad agent Ari Ben-Menash, remember his name, he comes up again a lot, alleged that Maxwell was a Mossad agent and informed the Israeli embassy in London that nuclear technician Mordecai Vanunu, also remember his name, was leaking secrets about Israel's nuclear program, leading directly to Vanunu's kidnapping by Mossad, his extradition to Israel, and his subsequent 18-year imprisonment. Maxwell ended up dying under mysterious circumstances, supposedly falling off his yacht and drowning. However, it is likely that Israel had tried to have him assassinated. Despite Maxwell's reputation as a rich media mogul, his businesses weren't going well and he was actually going bankrupt. Likely in a bid to ensure he still kept his fortune, sources say he tried to blackmail Mossad with what he knew, after which Israel knew they could no longer keep him alive. Investigative journalists Thomas and Dillon argue that Maxwell was assassinated by a Mossad hit squad because he, facing financial ruin and the collapse of his empire, had attempted to blackmail the agency, as he needed a £400 million cash injection. Ben-Menash said that was a threat no one could expect to get away with. Robert Maxwell's family friend Laura Goldman claimed he was a double or even a triple agent for the Israelis, British, and Soviets, saying he had information about government ministers, about scientific discoveries, about internet and data information. I think that was valuable to many governments. In their book, Thomas and Dillon argued that Maxwell, facing financial ruin, attempted to blackmail Mossad, threatening to expose their joint operations, including the Promise scheme, unless they bailed him out. According to this theory, Mossad's spymaster could not risk exposure and dispatched a hit squad to eliminate him. According to one source, his family were never convinced that his death was natural, accidental, or a drowning. Adding to the intrigue, Maxwell, who had abandoned practicing his Jewish faith for much of his life, was given a state-like funeral in Israel and buried on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, facing the Western Wall. If you didn't know what any of that represented, without getting into the theology behind it, just know that that is the highest honor and best place for a Jew to be buried in. His funeral had many ministers attending, including Israeli President Chaim Herzog, Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, who delivered a eulogy, as well as 6 sitting and previous heads of the Israeli intelligence service. In his eulogy, Prime Minister Shamir said that Maxwell was a person who was greatly interested in the Israeli economy, invested money in Israel, and offered to put his wide contacts on the international arena at Israel's service. Maxwell was also a business partner of Charles Bronfman, the same Bronfman who started the megagroup with Leslie Wexner, mentioned earlier. The same megagroup that the NSA spy Schindler called a shadowy Israeli influence operation. God knows what secret deals and operations occurred behind closed doors between Maxwell and that group. The level of official honor bestowed upon a foreign businessman is extraordinary and has been widely interpreted as a tacit but powerful acknowledgement of his significant, albeit covert, service to the Israeli state. Robert Maxwell's role as a Mossad operative provides the foundational context for understanding the alleged intelligence network. According to documented sources, Maxwell was not merely connected to Israeli intelligence, he was an active participant in major intel operations. His death in 1991 marked the end of one of Israel's most valuable foreign assets, with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir stating at his funeral, "He has done more for Israel than can today be told." Okay, so you might be thinking that this Maxwell guy sure sounds like a great tool for Israel and the Mossad, but how does he link to Jeffrey Epstein and his operations? Well, it was through his introduction that Robert did of his daughter to Epstein. She was his favorite child and his most loyal confidant. He loved her so much that the very yacht that he supposedly fell off when he died was actually named after her, the Lady Ghislaine Maxwell. But before we get onto Ghislaine's role, we need to wrap up Robert Maxwell's role in all of this and make the connection between him and Epstein. Epstein actually had a close relationship with Maxwell and his daughter Ghislaine. Journalist Julie Brown, who first broke the Epstein case, pointed out the possibility of Epstein's link to Israeli intelligence due to his relationship with Robert Maxwell, saying Robert Maxwell certainly had those kinds of connections, and Epstein had a close relationship with Robert Maxwell. One of Epstein's victims, known by her pseudonym as Jane Doe 200, said she was told that Robert Maxwell was in the Mossad, and was led to believe by both Maxwell and Epstein that Epstein was as well. Israeli spy Ben Menashe said of Epstein that Maxwell introduced him to us, as in the Mossad, and he wanted us to accept him as part of our group. He also claimed that Epstein and Ghislaine were already dating in the 1980s, as opposed to the mainstream story of them meeting only after her father's death. Later on, Ben Menashe says that the ultimate order to embrace Epstein and involve him in the ongoing arms deal came from the bosses at Israeli intelligence headquarters, and that Ghislaine followed him and embraced Israeli intelligence soon after. Even the infamous Prince Andrew picture with the vocal trafficked victim Virginia Giuffre, with an unfortunately familiar face in the background, was taken at Robert Maxwell's house, showing how involved the Maxwells were in the operation. Ben Menashe stated that Epstein was often seen in Robert Maxwell's offices, with him making frequent trips to his London office when he would be coming back from his trips to Israel. He also said that Ghislaine accompanied her father so frequently that she was involved in his intelligence-related activities to some extent. And this was before he died and she took a more active position. There are so many more connections to be made, but let's look at what we can absolutely guarantee just with what we've covered in this section. 1. Robert Maxwell was an Israeli and Mossad asset, doing more for Israel than can today be told, as according to Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. 2. Ghislaine was Robert Maxwell's favorite daughter and was very involved with his operations, including to some extent his ties to the Israeli intelligence. 3. Epstein had a very close relationship with Robert Maxwell, going back decades, one where he frequently visited his offices, especially his London office on his way back from Israel, potentially maybe meeting Israeli officers there. 4. Robert Maxwell had introduced Epstein to the inner circle of Israeli intelligence, trying to get him integrated as an asset, and that the bosses at the Israeli Intel HQ wanted Epstein in. 5. We also know that Epstein and Maxwell both bragged about how Epstein was a Mossad agent. Even Ben Menashe claimed that Jeffrey Epstein was recruited into this intelligence network by Robert Maxwell, and that the sex trafficking ring was a Mossad-backed blackmail operation. Ben Menashe is cited pretty often. A US jury had once acquitted Ben Menashe of arms trafficking charges in 1990 after accepting that he had acted on behalf of Israel. And internal Israeli documents confirmed his employment in military intelligence. He later went further and said that Epstein and Ghislaine were Israeli spies running a honey trap operation to blackmail politicians for intelligence purposes. Yes, a former Mossad agent who was proven to have been working on behalf of Israel just straight up said it. Maxwell's close bond with Epstein, including Epstein's years aboard Maxwell's yacht, is cited as proof Epstein was handed to Mossad or trained. Investigative journalist Julie Brown explicitly said she finds it not beyond the realm of possibility that Epstein had Israeli intelligence connections given Maxwell's background. The similarities between the two men's deaths have not escaped notice. Both Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein died under mysterious circumstances while facing potential exposure of their activities. Both men could have very likely been targeted for the fear that they knew too much, with Israel worried that they could leak everything and take them down with them. By Epstein's side was his girlfriend and co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell. They had met before her father's death, but once Robert mysteriously fell off a yacht, she moved to America and got far more involved with Epstein than before. As his youngest and favorite child, Ghislaine was very involved and connected to her father's business and social life. When she had boarded the yacht after her father was pronounced dead, she had coolly walked into her late father's office and shredded all incriminating documents on board. She clearly knew what she was doing. She also blamed supposedly rogue Mossad agents for killing her father, refusing to accept the official cause of death and instead pinning it on a dark conspiracy. Kroll was unable to give Robert Maxwell the information he had wanted before Maxwell died under suspicious circumstances on his yacht in November 1991. Though media reports often say that his death was most likely a suicide, several biographers, investigators, and Ghislaine herself assert that he was murdered, having hit the end of the line in terms of his usefulness to those who had empowered his legal and illegal activities over the years. Many of them have asserted that rogue Mossad agents had been responsible, including Ghislaine herself. Ghislaine reportedly blames a dark conspiracy of Mossad renegades and Sicilian contract killers for taking her father's life. Soon after news of Robert Maxwell's death spread, his wife, accompanied by Ghislaine, headed to his place of death, his yacht, then located near the Canary Islands. Out of all of Robert Maxwell's children, was most intimately aware of the incriminating secrets of father's financial empire and espionage activities. It is against this backdrop of high-stakes espionage that Ghislaine's relationship with Epstein must be viewed. After her father's death, Ghislaine moved to the US and almost immediately became Epstein's inseparable partner. This connection is not dismissed as mere coincidence by proponents of the intelligence theory. Julie Brown has stated there was a possible connection between Epstein and Israeli intelligence precisely because of his close relationship with the Maxwell. More pointedly, a victim in a legal filing against Epstein's estate claimed she was led to believe by both Maxwell and Epstein that Epstein was as well a Mossad agent. In this context, Ghislaine is not just a girlfriend but a potential successor, bringing the methods, connections, and operational tradecraft of her father's world into a new partnership with Jeffrey Epstein. The Maxwells had a pre-existing high-level relationship with Israeli intelligence, and Ghislaine, as her father's favorite and confidant, was uniquely positioned to continue his work. Despite the souring of relationships near the end of his life, Robert Maxwell was still seen as such high regard due to all of his actions, as seen by the state-level funeral, the attendees, and even what Prime Minister Shamir said about him. Ghislaine just inherited those things, and Epstein, already being involved with Israeli intelligence at that point, through his other two links, Leslie Wexner, Robert Maxwell, and all the contacts he made through them, would go about solidifying Israeli influence in the United States. This relationship provided Epstein with even more direct access to established intelligence networks and operational methods. One source said, "If I was running Mossad operations, I would want Ghislaine Maxwell on my payroll. I would want her working for us because she has access to the kinds of people whose views are very important in terms of the way in which the world functions." Epstein had the financial backing and technological sophistication, but the Oxford-educated Ghislaine Maxwell brought the international pedigree, social legitimacy, and access, and potentially her inherited knowledge of intelligence tradecraft. It was through Ghislaine, after all, that Epstein even got into contact with Prince Andrew, with whom she had had a long-standing relationship, as well as Bill Clinton. She also allegedly met Jean-Luc Brunel, a key figure in Epstein's modeling industry activities, which itself was a trafficking front, through work she was doing for her father in the 1980s. Ghislaine's role in this cannot be understated. She was not a mere subordinate or girlfriend, but a central operator. She was convicted of child sex trafficking and conspiracy for her role as Epstein's chief recruiter. She was a trained helicopter pilot who transported Epstein and his guests, and Epstein even named one of his Florida-based corporations after her. This operation could not have worked without Ghislaine's role. Having a well-spoken member of the British aristocracy really helped victims let their guard down. And we must not also forget that just for her being a woman, it became so much easier for victims to trust her. A US court had actually ruled that Jeffrey Epstein could not have sexually abused girls without a posh, smiling Ghislaine Maxwell grooming them. Alison Moe, the assistant US attorney, argued that the sophisticated and dangerous predator's presence, talking about Maxwell, made young girls feel comfortable spending time with Epstein. Otherwise, receiving an invitation to spend time with a middle-aged man would have seemed creepy and set off alarm bells. She used her status as a sophisticated, well-connected woman to befriend and gain the trust of vulnerable girls. She would take them shopping or to the movies, inquire about their families, and present herself as a mentor figure. A US district attorney even said that her presence alone as an adult woman would ease victims who were in the company of a middle-aged man, Epstein, doing inappropriate things. She also discussed sexual topics undressed in front of victims and was present when victims were undressing, and even encouraged the victims to massage Epstein. Even the victim recruitment structure was similar to how intelligence agencies recruit, effectively using a pyramid scheme structure, where victims who were abused were paid to bring their friends in, much like how intel agencies use blackmail against victims to recruit and find more compromised individuals. If the ultimate goal were merely Epstein's twisted predation, such a complex and risky expansion strategy would be unfavorable. However, if the goal was to create a vast library of compromise on a wide array of powerful individuals who were allegedly past victims, then this business-like scalable structure is perfectly logical. The same pseudonymed victim, Jane Doe 200, also said that Epstein and Ghislaine hinted that he was an agent for Mossad, just like Robert Maxwell. What makes this story more believable wasn't just that it was said under oath, but that Ghislaine allegedly warned Jane Doe that it was not good to be Epstein's enemy, and that Epstein's Mossad status helped him scare his victims into silence, as victims genuinely believed that any reporting of the rape against a Mossad agent with some of the most unique connections in the world would result in significant bodily harm or death to her. Even Epstein himself had told people he worked for the CIA and Mossad when Ghislaine had first come to New York. Okay, so here's what we know so far. 1. Ghislaine Maxwell. Mossad spy Robert Maxwell's favorite and closest child had suspected that her father's death was not natural and that he was killed by rogue Mossad agents because he knew too much. 2. Despite this, the Maxwells were still held in high regard, and her already having her own Israeli intel connections and experience from her time working for her father. One intelligence source said, if I was running a Mossad operation, I would want to have Ghislaine Maxwell on my payroll. 3. We've already covered Epstein's previous financial and social connections via Leslie Wexner pushing him towards power, as well as Israeli influence, in addition to all the doors opened by Robert Maxwell. Now he had Maxwell's daughter, and the couple had an unbreakable link with Israeli intelligence. 4. Ghislaine was absolutely central in the trafficking operation, not just in terms of setting up the clients such as Prince Andrew or Bill Clinton with her network, but also to procure the victims who could not have been trafficked without her presence. 5. Both Ghislaine and Epstein have blabbered on multiple times that Epstein was a Mossad agent and that he can hurt them if they spoke out. Well, is that all? Sure, there can't be more connections, right? Oh, you bet there are. All these connections do sound quite bad. They all have very strong links to Israeli institutions. But surely he has no actual links to Israeli leaders, right? That would be extremely suspicious on its own. He hasn't got any, right? Well, meet Ehud Barak, one of Israel's most decorated military heroes, a former commander of the elite Sayeret Matkal Commando Unit, head of military intelligence Amman, former chief of staff at the Israeli Defense Force, aka the highest position in the army after having served 35 years in the IDF, former Minister of Israeli Affairs, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, former Minister of Defense, and former Prime Minister of Israel. Quite a decorated man, and someone who by no means is unaware of the political and intelligence relations between institutions and countries. An individual with such a deep background in intelligence, counterintelligence, and national security would be expected to exercise extreme caution in their associations. Well, we know from flight logs and his own admission that Barak and Epstein had met dozens of times over the years, over 30 times between 2013 and 2017. Barak even said that he was introduced to Epstein by Shimon Peres, another Israeli prime minister, in 2003. As if there weren't enough Israeli prime ministers in the story, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who was the Prime Minister of Israel before, during, and after his first arrest and deposition, when Epstein tried to run away to Israel, was also on the Epstein list of associates, along with Barak. Just one last Israeli Prime Minister, I promise. Epstein was also the link that JP Morgan executive Jess Staley sought when trying to access current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in 2011. This showed that whenever a business executive needs to reach an Israeli head of government, Epstein is the man to go, since he has links to virtually all of them. It's important to point out that Staley, who's also the former CEO of Barclays Bank, also visited Epstein's private island even after he was indicted for sex trafficking, with the lawsuit alleging that Staley may have been involved in Epstein's sex trafficking operation and has exchanged over 1,200 emails with Epstein. That man was trying to access Netanyahu. This all shows Epstein as a man who has extraordinary access to the political and diplomatic elites of Israel, especially if the official narrative they are pushing, which was that Epstein was just a financial connector, was true. Back to Ehud Barak. For a statesman of Barak's stature, a former head of government of a major US ally, to knowingly and repeatedly associate with a convicted child sex offender, someone like Barak would have been briefed many times not just about Epstein's link to Israeli intelligence agencies, but also his trafficking of minors. He did, after all, know Epstein before and after his first arrest and conviction, with his 36 meetings happening between 2013 and 2017, more than a decade after his arrest. So there is no excuse of ignorance. If it was truly just business or social, he would have cut off the relationship as soon as he got arrested. Barak visited his private mansions and properties in Florida and New York, and even flew multiple times on his private aircraft. He denied ever being involved in any parties, but the theory poses that he wouldn't be there for the parties, but to run through details of how to blackmail the American elites with all the hidden equipment. Barak even went on trips to his private island in the disgustingly named Lolita Express multiple times. Photos emerged of the former Israeli Prime Minister emerging Epstein's townhouse while covering his face in 2016, showing he knew that he shouldn't have been seen with Epstein or even associated with him in public. On the same day, images of young females were seen entering and exiting the residence. Epstein even funded Barak's tech startup in Tel Aviv. He invested millions of dollars to bankroll Barak's investment in an Israeli high-tech startup, Carbon, formerly Reporty Homeland Security, a company in which Barak was a controlling shareholder. The company's technology, which develops advanced software for emergency services, including video streaming and geolocation, is highly sensitive and of clear interest to security and intelligence agencies. Barak even received $2.4 million in funding from the Wexner Foundation. Yes, we are looping all the way around again. And this was back in 2004. Epstein was also involved in the arms and drugs trade in the 1980s, working for multiple governments around the world, likely including for Israel. So here's what we know with Epstein's relationship with the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. 1. Barak visited Epstein dozens of times over the years, both before and after his convictions, with over 30 visits between 2013 and 2017, years after he was convicted. 2. Barak visited all his properties, including his private jet named the Lolita Express, as well as his private island in the US Virgin Islands, Little St. James, where all his wild shenanigans would take place, multiple times. 3. Epstein was the guy JP Morgan went to when they wanted to meet with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, showing how insanely connected Epstein was to the Israeli political class, especially with how many prime ministers he knew. 4. Barak received millions in funding from both Epstein as well as Leslie Wexner's Wexner Foundation, showing how close they were and how close his whole operation is. 5. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who himself was the Israeli Prime Minister before, during, and after Epstein was locked up, and whilst Epstein was in Israel too, was also in the Epstein files. This high frequency of contact between a known sex offender and a former head of military intelligence presents a profound logical contradiction. As mentioned, any politician or individual with such a deep background in intelligence, counterintelligence, and national security would be expected to exercise extreme caution in their associations, leading us to think that this wasn't just a relationship grounded in business or friendship. Barack wasn't just meeting Epstein far after he was convicted sex trafficker to get investment for his company, but likely for national security purposes. Part of a state-sanctioned operation where the risk was deemed necessary for a greater strategic objective. Why else would a man with Barack's security background risk the immense reputational damage of such a close and prolonged association? Okay, are we finally finished with the Israeli and Mossad links to Epstein? Almost. I promise I'll be quick. Epstein's lawyer, the Harvard law professor who fought for him as his personal lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, also needs to be investigated. Before we speak about what Dershowitz did for Epstein, let's first get into their relationship together. Dershowitz met Epstein through his friend, Lady Rothschild. Dershowitz was described having an enduring fascination with fame, society, and wealth. If you get a chance to go to fancy places with lots of rich people and fly around on private planes, I think he probably finds that hard to resist. And that is where their relationship begins, which quickly became very close. He called Epstein brilliant and said that when they talked debating mathematics, genetics, law, and psychology, nobody finishes a sentence. We cut each other off all the time because we just get it. Epstein donated $6.5 million to Harvard to create a program for evolutionary dynamics, which coincidentally ended up employing Dershowitz as a faculty affiliate, despite the fact that he was a lawyer with no connection to biology. Asked by his wife if Dershowitz would remain friends if Epstein became broke, Dershowitz said, "I would be as interested in him as a friend if we had hamburgers on the boardwalk in Coney Island and talked about his ideas," and that Epstein was the only person outside his family whom he trusted to evaluate drafts of his books. Epstein and Dershowitz were more than just regular friends. One of the hedge funds Epstein invested in, Boston Provident, took on Dershowitz as a client because Epstein talked to the founder, Orrin Kramer. The next year, the fund sustained enormous losses. Epstein personally contacted Kramer and said, "One of us is going to make Alan whole, and if I have to do it, that is an outcome you will regret." This shocked Kramer because losing money is an outcome you expect as an investor, with Dershowitz already signing agreements and contracts. But Kramer promised to personally restore the investment. That is how close they were. This went far beyond business. There was something deeper connecting them together. Dershowitz was a crucial member of the Epstein legal team representing Epstein when he got arrested in 2005.
And so the West Palm Beach, this was down in Florida, the West Palm Beach Police Department starts looking into the guy, starts gathering more information, starts talking to more witnesses. And very quickly, this thing starts expanding out so that 2 witnesses becomes 4, and 4 becomes 8, and 8 becomes 16. It's like expanding a lot, and they're realizing they have a big issue on their hands. And as they're going through, the Netflix documentary, it leaves out a lot of really important information, but it's really good on this stuff. They interview like the chief of police in West Palm Beach there at the time, and you can see he is just flabbergasted, outraged, just to the point where, he says at one point that it cost him his faith in the U.S. criminal justice system, because he was getting stonewalled like crazy at the local level. People in his department or somewhere in the local government were leaking the information of the investigation to Jeffrey Epstein. So, for example, when they raided his house, finally went in there and all the computers had been taken away. It was totally ready for the raid and prepared for it. Everything was removed. And he was 100% tipped off, they say. And so he's facing this kind of resistance at the local level and the state prosecutor level. And so he does something that you don't do as a chief of police. He just went completely around his chain of command and went directly to the feds himself and said, I'm going to bring the feds in. Like, clearly the state and the local officials are just too corrupted, apparently. Maybe it's just because he's an important guy and they don't want to rock the boat and bring bad publicity. But whatever it is, I need to bring the heavy artillery in here because the feds aren't going to care. They're not, he's not big enough for them, supposedly. And so he gives it over to the feds. And that's when it ends up in the lap of Alex Acosta, who was the Southern District of Florida U.S. attorney at the time. And so they start looking into this guy and they start building out a case. You have this woman, Villanueva, I think her name was, who was the lead prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office on the Epstein case. And she, from all appearances at least, was very enthusiastic and earnest about trying to pursue this case and was very upset about how the whole thing was handled by her superiors. But they're building out a case and they get to the point where, and this was actually even before the West Palm Beach Police Department did this, the feds got handed a case with 40 something on the record underage witnesses accusing this guy, corroborating each other's stories, telling the exact same story of how they were recruited, what happened when they got there, what they were asked and made to do, everything down the line. Right? This is like when the West Palm Beach first went to the prosecutor after they started building their case. They said the guy like sort of chuckled and laughed. He was like, "This is gonna be the easiest case I've ever done. You know, this is open, and we're gonna put this guy away for 100 years. Like this is the easiest case we're ever gonna do." And he can't do it at the state level, so he hands it over to the feds. And open and shut. I mean, how do you get away from 40 on the record corroborating independent witnesses, right? You can discredit 1 or 2 or 10. You still got 30 left, you know? And goes to the feds, and they build out the case some more. They bring in more witnesses. They gather more evidence. And all of a sudden, the prosecutor, she starts running into obstacles of her own. One of the things, for example, they found out was that the computers that had been taken out of his house in West Palm Beach were in the possession of somebody connected to Epstein's lawyers. And so she put out a Department of Justice subpoena demanding those computers from the lawyers and the people. And the lawyers kind of, you know, they delay and have meetings and, you know, put things off and so forth. And these are some of them people we've heard of, Alan Dershowitz, people like that, who they delay, and so one day she goes to her bosses and she kind of grills them a little bit, like, what the hell is going on here? You know, what, she wrote this in an email, actually. She was very aggressive about it, though. She's like, I don't know what's happening here. I don't know what the deal is, but like we have a child predator on our hands with an open and shut case to put this guy away for the rest of our life. What is the problem here? And she gets reprimanded and told in no uncertain terms, your attitude is not appreciated and you need to back off and all these kind of things by her superior.
He's also called for the age of consent to be lowered to 15 or 14. In October 2007, the Miami Herald reported that U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, Alexander Acosta, secretly met with one of Epstein's attorneys, Jay Lefkowitz, and struck one of the most outrageous sweetheart deals of all time. According to the sentencing document obtained by his team, Epstein would 1. Plead guilty to minor felony state charges of procuring a person of under 18 for prostitution. 2. Epstein and any potential co-conspirators would be immune from such charges moving forward. 3. Epstein would agree to register as a sex offender. According to the sentencing document, the nature of Epstein's charges would have required a lowest possible prison sentence of 21.5 months. Instead, that document showed Epstein would serve 12 months in prison and 10 months of probation. A box was checked noting that this was a mitigated departure, or a decision to impose less severe penalties than the sentencing guidelines recommended. Ultimately, the final sentence was 18 months. Epstein was actually offered an even better deal initially, avoiding jail time altogether, as well as grand jury proceedings, virtually sweeping the entire investigation under the rug. But he rejected that deal, likely thinking he could have beaten the case. Even when he was sentenced, he was given his own private wing of the prison with his own security guards that he paid for. He was allowed to leave the premises of the prison for up to 7 days a week, 16 hours at a time, including up to 2 hours at his Palm Beach sex den. Since they didn't keep records of who visited him at prison or in the den, that meant he could have very well continued his pedophile ring activities while supposedly being in prison for those pedophile activities.
And so then one day, and this is while the subpoena's out for those computers, Alex Acosta personally goes and cuts a deal with Epstein's lawyers without telling the lead prosecutor who's looking into the case, without telling the victims, which is in contravention of victims' rights law. You know, if you're going to cut a deal with a sex offender, you got to tell the victims, hey, by the way, this is what's happening. Here's why we're doing it. And just so you know, he's going to be out of jail in a year or something. You have to tell them. And he cuts a deal with the lawyers that says that the federal government agrees not to prosecute Epstein for any of the crimes that are being alleged, any related crimes that have yet to be alleged, nor will they prosecute any of his accomplices, known or unknown. So crimes that come out in the future committed by people who aren't known about yet, those are covered under this immunity as well, right? It's the most blanket you can possibly imagine. And as a condition of the deal, the subpoena for his computers was dropped.
The 2008 deal was insanely suspicious. Not only did he receive an unheard of sentence, 13 months, essentially not even in prison, But every level of those institutions was stonewalling the prosecutors, and the friction was enough to prevent them from going forth. Epstein also secured a non-prosecution agreement that barred his victims from bringing claims against him, while simultaneously shielding his co-conspirators from prosecution. To show how Epstein was protected from the legal system throughout his career, he was also involved with Towers Financial Corporation, founded by Steve Hoffenberg, who was later convicted for orchestrating one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history prior to Bernie Madoff. Hoffenberg has repeatedly claimed that he hired Epstein specifically to assist in the fraud. Hoffenberg described Epstein as his wingman and unindicted co-conspirator in a scheme that defrauded investors of hundreds of millions of dollars, as well as calling Epstein his best friend and closest friend for years.
That he said that what Epstein would do, and he did this to Hoffenberg himself eventually, is the people that they would be moving money around for, they would take some of that for themselves. And Epstein had a scheme that he called playing the box, which I don't know where the name exactly comes from, but what it entailed is stealing money from people and making sure that you have compromising information on them so that even if they catch you doing it, they're going to be too embarrassed or too afraid to actually come out and go after you. And he says that Epstein used to talk quite openly about his connections and dealings with the intelligence community, not just in the U.S., but in Israel as well.
While Epstein was never charged, his deep involvement is corroborated by court records and legal testimony. A lawyer for the committee representing defrauded investors stated that Epstein was a senior VP and the number 2 or number 3 person at the firm. The fact that Epstein walked away from a massive career-ending criminal conspiracy unscathed, while his direct supervisor went to prison for 20 years, shows an early and recurring pattern of apparent impunity that defies conventional explanation and supports the narrative that he may have been protected from the forces above. Even more shocking, Hoffenberg has stated that Epstein had boasted of his ties to Israel's intelligence services, claiming that it had been Ghislaine Maxwell who had made the introduction. An anonymous, independent, and well-placed source also corroborated the claim that Epstein had been an intelligence asset for Israel. It is interesting how Epstein got off scot-free in 1997, 1 year after he met Alan Dershowitz. A similar sentiment was relayed in the testimony of Epstein's victim Virginia Giuffre. In 2016 had said under oath that one of the original FBI agents that interviewed her in 2006 told her 5 years later that he wanted to continue investigating Epstein, but that his hands were tied by the chain of command and that it didn't look like the investigation would go anywhere. It all starts to make sense though, when reading attorney Acosta's comments on the record about why he gave him such an easy deal, as well as going round the victims' heads. Acosta said that he was told Epstein belonged to intelligence, to leave it alone, and that he was above his pay grade.
Yeah, and so just so everybody understands here, I mean, this is a guy who, again, over 40 on-the-record witnesses, most of them underage, corroborating each other's stories independently of this guy sexually assaulting underage girls for years. He gets this non-prosecution agreement with the federal government in perpetuity, him and all of his accomplices, known and unknown, for crimes known and unknown. And it gets sent down to the state level, and he agrees to a 2-year term down there in southern Florida, not in a federal prison, not in a state prison, at the county jail, where he has, it sounds like I'm making this up, I'm not. He has his own wing of the jail to himself. His cell door remains open. He gets out on work release for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, accompanied only by security that he pays the salary of. He only has to stay the night there 6 days a week and then spend 1 day a week there in the jail. So, So
it's like the National Guard.
Yeah. And again, you're not talking about a guy who got busted embezzling funds. You're talking about a guy who got busted doing the thing that if you were to poll every American, I believe, and ask them, what's the worst thing? What is the worst thing that anybody can do that you would, you're against the death penalty that you might make an exception for? It's molesting little children. Everybody kind of agrees that is the red line. Everybody feels that way, that I know, that you know, that everybody listening to this knows. And so you ask, what are the possible reasons that could be big enough and important enough that they would let a guy like this have it's insulting to the investigators, to the police, to the prosecutors to give a guy a deal like that,
The pieces of this puzzle, how Epstein was able to essentially legally get away with child prostitution, start fitting together now. It starts to make sense when we dig into his own lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, the man who we've established has a very close and personal connection to Epstein that transcends business. Dershowitz has long been one of the most ardent and almost blind supporters of the state of Israel.
Jews are too powerful. We're too strong. We're too rich. We control the media. We have too much this, we have too much that. And we often apologetically deny our strength and our power. Don't do that. Don't do that. We have earned the right to influence public debate. We have earned the right to be heard. We have contributed disproportionately to the success of this country. Never, ever apologize for using our strength and our influence in the interest of peace. And if you need a biblical source for it, just remember the psalmist who said, Hashem owes li'amo yitain. God will give the Jewish people strength, owes. And then, only then, Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom. Only then will God give the Jewish people peace. Peace will come for the Jewish people and the Jewish nation only through strength.
He has authored numerous books on the subject, including The Case for Israel, Defending Israel, and The Case Against BDS. He's a frequent speaker at pro-Israel events, on college campuses, and in the media. He's been known to appear on multiple televised debates to defend the Israeli state from absolutely all criticism, such as various interviews, Oxford Union debates, and most importantly, so many appearances on the Piers Morgan Uncensored show defending Israel's actions. But that's not necessarily a crime. He's just a big supporter of Israel, right? Well, it goes much deeper than that. He's a close friend and advisor of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and was involved in many elite political circles in Israel. He's even written an article trying to argue that Israel has committed no war crimes despite the International Court of Justice, the European Union, and even the American government admitting such claims, as well as him almost representing Israel at the ICJ.
Now, the one point I do want to make is that I understand all the feminist groups and the radicals who think this is the worst thing in the world, that anybody ever had any contact with Jeffrey Epstein. Where are all those radical feminists when it comes to the Hamas rapes, the incredible hypocrisy of the Me Too movement? Me Too, except if you're a Jew. And I want to have a list of all the radical feminists who are pushing hard, and I understand that, to get all these names revealed. And I want to know how many of them have ever actually condemned Hamas.
It's not just that he has strong links to the Prime Minister or other Israeli heads, but there are links to Mossad too. When asked if Epstein was a Mossad agent, he expectedly denied it, but the way he denied it was definitely not normal. He said that he had checked with his sources in Mossad, who confirmed that Epstein was not part of Mossad. Very reassuring. He also represented Mossad as their lawyer in the case, as well as having business dealings with previously mentioned Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Even the US government had concerns that Dershowitz was an Israeli spy for Mossad, as shown by an American intelligence report. The report also confirmed American suspicions that Epstein was a Mossad spy too. Unsealed Epstein documents mentioned Dershowitz 137 times, with an accusation that he had raped an underage girl. The report confirms his ties to Netanyahu, his far-right allies, and Mossad, as investigators had received evidence that suggested Dershowitz acted at the behest of Israel, which would have pushed him to embrace Trump. It's important to point out that Dershowitz also represented Trump in his first impeachment trial. He also worked for the extremely Zionist pro-Israel billionaire Sheldon Adelson, who was behind the move of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, as well as his wife pushing for Israel to annex the entire West Bank. The one thing people don't often know is that after Epstein realized he might have actually been jailed, he fled the United States. There are no prizes for guessing which country he moved all his money and where he fled to.
So, okay, let's just set this in time and place. The feds are basically protecting Jeffrey Epstein in 2007-ish. That's the Bush administration. Yeah. And it clearly, this is a very high-profile thing. It was in the papers. DOJ, this is their, Acosta is a U.S. attorney. He's the federal prosecutor in Southern District of Florida, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So what does DOJ think of this? Like, why are they involved in it?
I mean, involved in, like, the cover-up?
The cover-up.
I think, that's the interesting question. I go back to the question I asked earlier. Like, a U.S. attorney is pretty high up. He's running the Southern District of Florida's U.S. Attorney's Office. That guy, there's not that many people above his head who can tell him to drop a case like this. I mean, you got to think about it like this, too. I mean, this is a career case for a prosecutor like Acosta. I mean, you're going to be attorney general behind this case someday. You talk billionaire playboy, putting him away for his entire life because he's sexually abusing underage girls for years and years. I mean, this makes your whole career. And so to drop that, there's only a couple people and a couple reasons that somebody like him would agree to do that. One of the things that might have had something to do with it is before Jeffrey Epstein was sentenced, for whatever reason, you have this billionaire who's just the definition of a flight risk. They don't take his passport away. And before he's sentenced, he flees the country, goes to Israel, stays there for several months, moved all his money offshore by this point. And while he's in Israel, he's telling people there that he's thinking about staying, because you can actually do that. They don't extradite, Jewish criminals, at least, who flee to Israel. There's a organization called Jewish Community Watch, which is a Jewish organization that tracks pedophiles who have fled the United States to go to Israel, where there's no extradition of Jewish criminals there. And between just the years, I think it was 2010 when they opened up, and 2016, 2017 when this story was written, so a period of 6 years, there were already 60 pedophiles from the United States that had fled to Israel and were living freely there. Some of them had reoffended there and got thrown in Israeli jails. But so this is a thing, and Jeffrey Epstein was over there.
Why doesn't the U.S. government demand the government of Israel send them back?
I mean, you've been self-employed for a while, but when you weren't, was it your habit to go to your boss and make demands of them on a regular basis? I don't know. I mean, since when do we ever make demands on Israel? Him being in Israel and at least having the threat of staying there, that may have played a role in him cutting his deal, because that's when his deal was cut.
He's already been charged at this point.
He's awaiting sentencing.
He's been convicted?
And they don't take his passport, and he leaves the country.
He's been convicted and he leaves the country?
Correct.
Bear in mind, as mentioned earlier, that he fled to Israel when Ehud Olmert was prime minister, who was also in the Epstein files and clearly knew Epstein well. As one source says, close ties to Israel's government later in his life can also be seen in an odd visit Epstein made to Israel in 2008. In April of that year, the Palm Beach Daily News reported that Epstein was staying at the Tel Aviv Hilton, and quoted an Epstein spokesman as saying that he was spending Passover, meeting with Israeli research scientists, and taking a tour of military bases. Access to military bases is certainly not something easily obtained by tourists to Israel, even very wealthy ones. Again, suggesting that Epstein had long-standing connections to Israel's national security apparatus, along with his friendship to Ehud Barak. Some have speculated that the timing of this trip saw Epstein implore prominent Israelis for aid in his legal troubles back in the US. Ehud Barak was a key reason behind Bill Clinton's controversial pardon of Mark Rich, and Epstein may have thought a similar intervention could work to his benefit. So once more, here is what we know. 1. Epstein, a man we already have so many links to Mossad with, gets arrested and is facing 40 underage victims who are corroborating each other's stories. 2. The evidence is so overwhelming that the prosecutors are preparing for insane life sentences like 100 years in prison. But they suddenly find that every level of enforcement in the justice system is working for Epstein, not against him. 3. Alan Dershowitz, one of the biggest public defenders of Israel, a man who not just is active in the Israeli political circles, who intimately knew Epstein for years as well as being friends with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also represented Mossad, and is also suspected by the US government of being a Mossad agent, represents Epstein. 4. District Attorney Acosta, who had a case on his hands that could have been career-defining and generational, cementing him as one of the greatest legal figures in American history, goes around the victims and virtually gets Epstein completely off the hook. The deal involved the retraction of subpoenas for his computers, as well as dropping charges against any co-conspirators and any future charges from any of Epstein's victims. And when asked why, Acosta says that he was told to let Epstein off the hook since he belonged to intelligence and that he was above his pay grade. 5. Let's not forget the fact that Epstein tried to reject the deal initially, thinking he could have successfully evaded the justice system completely. 6. After he's been convicted, for whatever reason, his passport isn't taken off him, and he flees to Israel, where he tells everyone he's planning to stay there. 7. Epstein also walked away scot-free from the Towers financial Ponzi scheme, in which he was the number 2 guy, whilst the number 1 guy got 20 years in prison. This coincidentally happened 1 year after he met Alan Dershowitz, Mossad's lawyer, and potentially the guy behind Epstein also getting away with his 2008 deal. As a side note, if you found this video useful or informative, subscribing would be helpful.
You have these connections that Epstein denies, which again, if they were innocent connections, he probably wouldn't have a reason to do that. All of these intelligence connections, but all these other guys, these are people who were not only active, but absolutely central to the most high-profile operations that were going on in the 1980s. And Jeffrey Epstein is right there in the middle of all of them, and they all seem to think that he's pretty damn important.
Okay, we finally finished the section. Don't look at the time. I'm sure we haven't got much time left. So Epstein is an Israeli or Mossad agent. Why is that important? Well, to start off with what he did, He ran parties and a sex trafficking operation to try and connect wealthy and powerful figures such as Presidents Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, Bill Gates, New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, billionaire hedge fund manager Glenn Dublin, Leonardo DiCaprio, Michael Jackson, and so many more members of Congress, the White House, Hollywood, royalties, the scientific world, and other elites. These members were either linked to Epstein or have been saved down in the Epstein files or Black Book, and many have been accused of sexual assault and rape, often by girls who were minors at the time. Senators were even reported to have been recorded with girls at Wexner's properties. During a 2005 search of Epstein's Palm Beach mansion, police discovered hidden cameras. Journalist Nick Bryant later reported that Epstein's residences in New York, Palm Beach, New Mexico, and Paris, as well as his private Boeing 727, were peppered with hidden cameras in the bedrooms and bathrooms, as well as his private island, Little St. James, in the US Virgin Islands. The explicit purpose of these recordings, according to sources, was to capture powerful guests in compromising situations, creating a library of blackmail material. The DOJ itself, in a memo explaining why it would not release all Epstein-related files, acknowledged being in possession of more than 10,000 videos and images that depicted child sexual abuse material or other pornography. The inventory included 40 computers and electronic devices, 26 storage drives, more than 70 CDs, and 6 recording devices, holding a total of more than 300 gigabytes of data in a massive, large-scale surveillance operation. This guy wasn't just recording this for his own twisted pleasure. The strategic value of such a network, if leveraged through blackmail, is honestly incomprehensible. Compromising material of politicians could influence legislation, foreign policy, and appointments. Leverage over financiers could be used to manipulate markets or gain inside information. Access to top scientists could yield sensitive intellectual property or direct the course of research. Influence over royals and celebrities could be used to shape public opinion and grant legitimacy to various causes or individuals. The operation was not just about collecting damaging information on individuals. It was about acquiring the potential to influence entire systems. For a blackmail operation to be effective, it requires a systemic method for collecting compromising material. We know that Epstein's properties were designed precisely for this purpose. Epstein's career trajectory and operational methods align with the profile of an Access agent. As described by former CIA agent John Kiriakou, an Access agent's primary function is not to be a formal spy, but to use their social and professional position to cultivate relationships with high-value targets and provide access for an intelligence service. Epstein's entire life appears to have been dedicated to this function. The most direct allusions to a blackmail scheme come from court documents and victim testimonies. During a 2015 deposition against Ghislaine Maxwell, Virginia Giuffre was questioned extensively about being used to gather intelligence. Her lawyer, Paul Castle, asked Jeffrey Epstein directly if he had instructed Giuffre to provide a full report on the details of what men like Prince Andrew did to her, so that you would have blackmail material you could use. Epstein repeatedly invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination in response to this and other related questions, including whether he had attempted to blackmail Prince Andrew. For those who are unaware, pleading the Fifth is using your right to remain silent, which essentially means they admit to doing it, but you can't legally charge them for that. It's the equivalent of the child who has chocolate around his mouth, saying he doesn't know who ate the chocolate. You know he did it, he knows he did it, everyone knows he did it, but you can't legally charge him for that unless you have evidence or a direct confession. Another accuser, Sarah Ransom, claimed in a now retracted statement that Epstein had secretly filmed high-profile men, including Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, and Richard Branson. Beyond general claims, at least one specific instance of attempted blackmail has been reported. According to the Wall Street Journal, Epstein attempted to blackmail Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates in 2017. Epstein had learned of an affair Gates had with a Russian bridge player, Mila Antonova, and Epstein paid for her to attend a software coding camp. After Gates declined to join a multi-billion-dollar charitable fund Epstein was trying to establish with JP Morgan Chase, Epstein allegedly sent Gates a threatening email demanding reimbursement for the cost of Antonova's tuition, threatening to expose the affair. You see what he did? Provide a service to them, learn their secrets, and then blackmail them exactly as an Access agent would do when you need to. In this case, it was just for money. But what would blackmail against a politician or even a president involve? A 2014 civil suit alleged Epstein lent underage girls to prominent American politicians, powerful business executives, foreign presidents, a well-known prime minister, and other world leaders, with the lawsuit explicitly mentioning that none other than his lawyer, Alan Dershowitz, as having raped one of the victims. Ben Menashe said that Epstein and the Maxwells were Mossad spies running a honey trap operation to blackmail politicians, luring figures into compromising situations for Israeli intelligence. Ben Menashe had said that the two agents, Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, weren't very competent, but that they found a niche blackmailing American and other political figures. Mr. Epstein was a simple idiot who was going around providing girls to all kinds of politicians in the United States. See, f***ing around is not a crime. It could be embarrassing, but it's not a crime. But fucking a 14-year-old girl is a crime, And he was taking photos of politicians fucking 14-year-old girls. If you want to get it straight, they would just blackmail people. They would just blackmail people like that. The compromise he had on these political, business, and media elites was honestly staggering. Epstein himself had reportedly said that if I said what I know about both candidates, they'd have to cancel the 2016 election. So now the question falls down to this. Why would Israel do this? Well, it gives them immense leverage over the biggest superpower in the world. Have a listen to what FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino said.
About a year and a half after that, I'm in a green room at Fox, and I'm not going to say who because they didn't give me permission to share it, but, well, the short story, but not who they are. It says, you know, Epstein's an intelligence asset for people in the Middle East, right? I'm like, no, I didn't know that. I'm like, you sure of that? The person, let's say, is like, I'm absolutely sure of that. Meaning, his plane and that island, the cameras, there's a big assumption out there that these videotapes were exclusively in the custody of Epstein. That's a huge mistake. The reason they wanted this story to go away is because there's an assumption like, oh yeah, Epstein had him. No, he wasn't the only one who had him, according to this source. These assets, that's why this blackmail story makes so much sense. Which Middle Eastern countries they are, I don't know. But this person, who's a very, very good reporter, I mean, aces, right? Swore Epstein was either a witting or unwitting intelligence asset, and they may have had his plane wired up, and they're the ones who have all this stuff. So the point is, to sum it up, how do you know some of these countries aren't going to some of these power players who aren't making decisions because, hey, you wouldn't want this video out there, right? How do you know?
100%.
During this period, which was the early to mid-1980s, Israeli intelligence was already involved in sexual blackmail operations domestically within the United States. The 1990s saw a proliferation of Israeli espionage activity. Ben Minash had alleged that Epstein's sexual blackmail operation was created at Israel's behest specifically to blackmail President Bill Clinton, saying the following: the Israelis feared that Mr. Clinton, when he was campaigning for president, will be a repeat of Mr. Carter. He wanted to press them for peace with the Palestinians and all that stuff. Mr. Epstein was sent early on to catch up with President Clinton. Israel had allegedly been behind the effort to blackmail President Carter through his brother, Billy Carter. Epstein's blackmail operation is believed to have been set up in 1991, the same year the mega group was created by Leslie Wexner. We also know that the British media was also reporting on his Israeli intelligence ties, and that Epstein was also known to have visited the White House 17 times in just 2 years when Clinton was president, with specific politicians targeted for their involvement in Middle Eastern negotiations. There's also a proven historical precedent. Intelligence agencies have historically used sexual blackmail operations or tried to gather intel via espionage on other nations, even allies. The most famous case is that of Jonathan Pollard, mentioned earlier, a US Navy civilian intelligence analyst who was arrested in 1985 for spying on Israel. Pollard passed enormous quantities of classified US military intelligence to his Israeli handlers and was sentenced to life in prison. Although Israel initially claimed it was a rogue operation, it later granted Pollard Israeli citizenship and lobbied for decades for his release, which was granted in 2015. Investigative author Gordon Thomas has written extensively on Mossad. In Gideon's Spies, The Secret History of the Mossad, he details the agency's alleged use of compromise and blackmail as standard operating procedure. Thomas claims, for example, that Mossad had compromising tapes of President Bill Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky, which it held for potential blackmail.
Let's also take a trip down memory lane.
This is crazy.
The 1990s, Benjamin Netanyahu, Bill Clinton, and Monica Lewinsky. Stick around for this one. So in a scandal that has been largely lost to contemporary memory, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was alleged to have blackmailed then-President Bill Clinton by revealing to him that Israel had collected tapes of phone sex calls between the 42nd president and White House intern Monica Lewinsky. The story is worth revisiting amid allegations that Jeffrey Epstein was involved in a long-running Israeli blackmail operation of his own. So Clinton met with Netanyahu in the Oval Office in February 1997. Subsequently, according to testimony Lewinsky gave to the special counsel's office, Clinton's secretary Betty Curry reached out to Lewinsky to invite her to an Oval Office meeting, telling her Clinton, quote, had something important to tell her, unquote. It would turn out to be their final sexual encounter, but Clinton also used the opportunity to tell her that a, quote, foreign embassy had tapped his phone and recorded their conversation, Lewinsky said. Clinton did not specify which embassy, though the meeting with Lewinsky came the month after his meeting with Netanyahu. The special prosecutor's report was far more concerned with Lewinsky's claim of the sexual encounter that day because it contradicted Clinton's claim that they had had only one encounter that year than they were with the fact that a foreign government was spying on the president and letting him know about it. The prosecutor was also interested in Clinton's response, namely that he proposed cover stories. These are cover stories that the two could employ if they were confronted with the tapes. Clinton suggested the pair say they knew they were under surveillance and the phone sex was a, quote, put on for whoever was listening. That's an awfully flimsy idea, but look, he was guilty. The man did not have much to work with. Now, in April, Netanyahu and Clinton met again for a, quote, private visit. On a Saturday then, in May 1997, Clinton again had Curry invite Lewinsky to the White House. During that visit, he broke up with her, Lewinsky testified. The next fall, so this is fall of 1998, Clinton hosted Netanyahu and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat for a summit at Wye River, Maryland. Toward the end of the summit, at 7 a.m., after a long night of final negotiations and handshakes, Netanyahu approached Clinton privately to demand the release of convicted Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard, long a cause célèbre of the Israeli far right. That's according to reporting at the time from the New York Times. Now, Netanyahu brought up the sex tapes in the context of the Pollard demand, according to subsequent reporting by Washington Examiner editor Daniel Harper in his book, Clinton, Inc., The Audacious Rebuilding of a Political Machine. He writes, quote, not wanting to directly threaten the powerful American president, a crucial Israeli ally, Clinton was told that the Israeli government had thrown the tapes away, but the very mention of them was enough to constitute a form of blackmail, Halpern reported. The talks almost broke down as CIA chief George Tenet told Clinton he would resign on the spot if Clinton agreed to the terms. So instead, Clinton agreed to, quote, review Pollard's case. He did not release him. Pollard was eventually freed in 2015 under the Obama administration. Now, on the last day of his first term, Trump pardoned Pollard's handler. Back in Israel, Pollard is now an outspoken supporter of extremist National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, and has called for the full ethnic cleansing of Gaza. I don't know, Emily, what do you think? What did Netanyahu tell Bill Clinton?
I'm so curious.
Was there another foreign embassy that this could be?
Possibly the worst part was that Israel went on to hand that same classified military intelligence to America's biggest enemy, the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Soviet KGB was infamous for its use of female agents known as swallows to seduce and compromise foreign diplomats and officials. The CIA's World War II predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, had a field manual that explicitly detailed how to use bribery and blackmail, including inducing drug dependency, to control and manipulate targets. Mossad has employed honey traps in its operation. Such is the case of the 1986 capture of Israeli nuclear whistleblower Mordechai Vanunu, mentioned earlier. After Vanunu revealed details of Israel's secret nuclear program to the British press, he was lured from London to Rome by a female Mossad agent posing as an American tourist named Cindy. Once in Rome, he was drugged, kidnapped, and smuggled back to Israel, where he was tried for treason and imprisoned for 18 years. This case provides a specific documented instance of Mossad successfully using a female agent in a honey trap operation, all to neutralize a perceived threat to national security. As we've seen right at the start of this video, there are many examples of Israel collecting intel on American institutions and even selling it to China or the Russians. If they can do that, what's to say they can't use that intel to blackmail politicians to get their way, like we've seen them do? Let's look briefly at the role of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. It is essentially a pro-Israel lobbying group which for some reason doesn't have to register as a foreign agent, despite the group trying to solidify Israeli influence and shape public discourse. It's done this largely through rewarding or punishing politicians that stand with or against Israeli causes respectively. They don't care for track records on democracy, human rights, or even what helps out Americans, but only care for one thing. What is your opinion on Israel? This is all done in an effort to try and exert Israeli influence and control over the American government, and fill it with politicians sympathetic to their cause. Chicago University professor John Mearsheimer and Harvard professor Stephen Walt say AIPAC's success is due to its ability to reward legislators and congressional candidates who support its agenda, and to punish those who challenge it. AIPAC makes sure that its friends get strong financial support from the many pro-Israel political action committees. Anyone that is seen as hostile to Israel can be sure that AIPAC will direct campaign contributions to his or her political opponents. The bottom line is that AIPAC, a de facto agent for a foreign government, has a stranglehold on Congress, with the result that US policy towards Israel is not debated there, even though that policy has important consequences for the entire world. We saw this with the campaign against Cori Bush in Missouri and Jamal Bowman in New York, whose opponents received $8.5 million and $17 million respectively to defeat them, for no other reason than Bush and Bowman were very vocally critical of Israel. Donna Edwards of Maryland was also defeated by AIPAC after they donated $6 million to her opponent, more than any other organization in that election. As AIPAC said, she didn't support Israel enough. Again, it's not that she didn't support Israel, but that she didn't support them enough. You gotta be on the floor kissing their boot for them to be satisfied. It's clear that Israel and AIPAC's vision for Congress is not one that looks out for the interests of Americans, but that of Israel, as seen by Jeffrey Epstein's pedophile sex trafficking rings. Which is why it's so worrying to see that the links that Epstein has to Israel and Mossad, knowing the kind of blackmail they had on them. Americans should want to know if their government is being controlled by a foreign government. And it's interesting seeing the influencers and politicians who are saying they don't want to see the Epstein files released. They are the biggest public supporters of Israel possible.
When they said there was no credible evidence of blackmail or that he was working for a foreign intelligence agency or a domestic intelligence agency, when the FBI and DOJ said that, that was all part of a broader Trump cover-up. Now, if you're going to make that accusation, then presumably Trump would have to be covering up something pretty bad, something pretty dark, right? If the idea is that Trump, we're going to be complicit in the most evil of evil things, which is the engagement of and then blackmail based on that, and that Trump is covering that up. If you're going to make that claim, which again is something that many of these folks will sort of suggest, imply, spill out there without naming Trump personally.
Honestly, I'm done talking about Epstein for the time being. I'm going to trust my friends in the administration. I'm going to trust my friends in the government to do what needs to be done, solve it.
Your job, unless you worked for the government, right? They lie about everything. Slow roll the lies about everything. Remember when Jeffrey Epstein died in jail and somehow the cameras weren't working for those few minutes? Nobody was checking the cameras for those few minutes. You know, we have cameras at my house. The Epstein list. Why is it that Jeffrey Epstein dies in jail and the cameras went out and all that kind of thing? And why would the FBI be hiding that? Unless there's something really weird, particularly with the Democrat Party and all the celebs. Do you trust the government? The government? I trust Dan Bongino. I have no reason not to trust Kash Patel. I trust Donald Trump at the moment as much as I trust anyone else. But they may just not have it. Like maybe Epstein was smart enough not to have an actual list written out that said all of the specifics.
You know, do I think he was an intelligence asset? Yeah, probably. Do I think he was doing something with the CIA, FBI, Mossad? They're even talking about KGB. This guy was everywhere. So why are people so obsessed with this story? Like, what are you hoping to find exactly?
Okay.
In my opinion, there's a lot of people that are obsessed with this. And these are the types of people, in my opinion, that a lot of these people are what I would call losers. And they're fat, they're broke, they're losers, they can't get this, they can't get that. They're struggling with work, they're struggling in their relationships. They have nothing going on in their life, but this shiny little object they are obsessed with.
Adam, that guy that's drinking Mountain Dew in his trailer and sitting there who's an American patriot that pays his taxes and has kids and a family, Adam, he wants to know if the government that he's living under is controlled by foreign countries because they have tapes of them raping fucking underage kids. Adam, it's not a shiny little thing. No, Adam,
I don't think
it's not a shiny little thing in the air.
Everything
And
you
they're
were
not
right.
stupid.
Several intelligence professionals have weighed in on the allegations. Former CIA officer John Kiriakou described Epstein as a textbook example of an Axis agent and suggested intelligence community reluctance to investigate Israeli connections due to the special relationship between the US and Israel. As previously mentioned, former Mossad agent Ben Menash claimed Epstein worked for Israeli military intelligence, specializing in honey traps to blackmail prominent figures. Former NSA analyst John Schindler suggested Epstein's operation had hallmarks of intelligence work, noting the scale and sophistication required. Even Kash Patel and Dan Bongino are annoyed, and bear in mind, this theory aligns with why this investigation has been such a car crash. The DOJ and FBI issued a report concluding Epstein had no client list and no evidence of blackmailing powerful politicians. This official finding directly contradicts the blackmail theory. In addition, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett publicly addressed the rumors, saying the accusation that Jeffrey Epstein somehow worked for Israel or the Mossad running a blackmail ring is categorically and totally false. Let's be honest, that did nothing but fuel people's doubts about that link. Because is the Prime Minister really going to come out and admit that Epstein was a Mossad agent? That would have the American political system in frenzy and would be nothing but chaos for Israel. In addition, the fact that Bennett felt the need to clarify this may indicate Israel's worry about getting caught. Realistically, if Epstein wasn't an agent, why would they care about the speculation? The truth would hopefully come out eventually. According to a report by NBC News, both FBI Director and Deputy Director Kash Patel and Dan Bongino have become increasingly distraught with Attorney General Pam Bondi over issues beyond the Epstein disclosures, leading to them resigning their posts. Bondi herself is in a sticky situation because before claiming there was no Epstein list, she had herself claimed that the Epstein list was sat on her desk waiting to be reviewed.
I saw your appearance at CPAC with Ben and with Ted Cruz, and one of the things that you alluded to, and this is something Donald Trump has talked about, the DOJ may be releasing the list of Jeffrey Epstein's clients. Will that really happen?
It's sitting on my desk right now to review. That's been a directive by President Trump.
Trump has now come out and called the Epstein case a hoax after campaigning to release the files, telling his supporters not to waste time and energy on Epstein. He called them weaklings and stupid Republicans for falling for it. I don't understand why the Jeffrey Epstein case would be of interest to anybody, he said. It's pretty boring stuff. It was even shown that there was almost 3 minutes missing from the official FBI so-called untampered and raw footage, of which had many different edits and editors in the video metadata. Sigrid McCauley, a lawyer for multiple Epstein victims, told News Station, "What's really just astonishing about this recent disclosure from the government is that they know they are sitting on a treasure trove of information and they are not turning it over. And I've worked on these cases for over 10 years now. There's a plethora of information that the public has not been able to see relating to Epstein and his co-conspirators. In the end, we can see that most people do not believe the official narrative. Epstein has so many links to Israel and Mossad, and we also know that he has so much compromise on these financial and political elites that it is a very real possibility that Israel and Mossad have a genuine stronghold of control over the United States. It's just a matter of time before all this information becomes public knowledge."